an interesting concept came about. It started with the first version of HeroQuest, Hero Wars, and has been more and more adopted by the publishers since. They called it Your Glorantha May Vary at first. The idea being that when you used the books, whatever new material you brought to it, you can consider just as official as anything else, and it exists for you, your table, your game, your way, and that someone from some other table or some other Gloranthophile community cannot come over and go, blah, 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 you're doing it all wrong. No, so yours varies. And you know what? You over there, critical person, yours does too. So the phrase actually morphed a bit, and I think very appropriately, from may to Your Glorantha will vary. So it's really saying, get over it. There is no canon. We've got what we've published here. Take it forth, go ye forth, and multiply it in some fashion as you see fit. And I personally extend that to older versions too. Say you are a huge, booster of, you came in on the Avalon Hill version in the early 90s and you loved it and you played the hell out of it and you're still doing it. And you have built all sorts of Glorantha-ness out of that starting information and through your own play. Fantastic. And so that's kind of the state of the art now. And with any luck at all, some of the rancor, opinions, personality, presences regarding actual Glorantha, will diminish. Well, I guess this is part 2, and it concerns Glorantha itself as a setting. I have to be careful here because the last thing you want is to watch this aging gentleman suddenly launch into what he thinks is beatnik poetry. So I'll try to contain myself. I already mentioned that Glorantha arose on the California coast in the late 60s. And everything about Glorantha shows this. Political subtext, the intense shamanism, the desire for fantasy to be mythic and to represent values under contention, the desire for heroes of a particular kinds, the way that people learned about mythology back then and anthropology are deeply evident in the construction of everything. Combine that with a pretty intensive, dedicated, dangerous, risky resolution system where both magic and fighting can rip you apart. And so you get a particular flavor and functionality of role-playing back then that really was, mind-blowing. You were not getting it from other games at that time. And it also, I have to emphasize, wasn't fantasy in the way that that term came to be known. Without going into details, by the mid-1980s, fantasy had become a recognizable genre, meaning that when you picked up a new fantasy book, it was going to taste a certain way, and it would have certain kind of heroes, and it would have certain kinds of structure. Before that, fantasy was a trash bag. You didn't even have fantasy sections on the shelves in bookstores. You didn't have fantasy, very few publishers, very few in the 70s were putting a fantasy on the cover as, a sector of publishing. And again, it was a truly fascinating time in the early mid-70s. Speaking from experience, you end up with a deep personal commitment to mythological information that you've grown up reading. You're also inundated with this bizarre overlap among underground comics, a few mainstream comics, rock and roll, the art of rock and roll, and fantasy fiction. The overlaps are so intensive and in many cases very well documented, and is just a remarkable phenomenon. But the main thing is that it's semi-underground, it's trippy, and when you pick up a fantasy story, you can bet it's going to push some boundaries. The degrees of violence, the degrees of sexuality, the degrees of intensity were remarkable. People combed the literature before that, and the Fafhrd in the 60s. That's when Conan, Tolkien, and Fafhrd and Greg Mouser stuff got revived. That stuff really hadn't penetrated very far at original publication. It's in the late 60s when all of this booms and gets picked up in all those things I just mentioned. And so you end up with sort of a new kind of fantasy that's both old in terms of ancient mythology, in terms of mid-20th century pulp literature, and now in terms of the ferment of, drugs, the pill, politics, sexual revolution. Everything is just booming, and this is truly a part of it. Glorantha is, I gotta say it, Glorantha is tits out right there in the middle of that. And so it's got playful humor. Howard the Duck was a popular comic book character in the mid-70s, and boom, there's a fantasy race for you right there in Glorantha. And that's just one thing. There's tons of other stuff that's humorous and playful, deadly serious in terms of, for example, character survival. Deadly serious sometimes in terms of the philosophical questions that are raised, and also extravagant, in the imagery. There's no attempt, none, to match it to a naturalistic bestiary or any. If it's nuts, throw it in. And so Glorantha is very much of its time and remains now as somewhat shocking or mysterious or puzzling to latecomers who look at it and say, what on earth is that doing in there? And that's not fantasy. They're used to fantasy of a particular very narrow kind and are not familiar with it when you pick up a new novel by Tanith Lee and you have no idea what's coming this time. So anyway, it's a fascinating, deal. Glorantha is quite moving to those of us who grew up in that same culture. And then, of course, it has had immense appeal for any number of people since then.